Welcome back to English with Kim. I'm Kim and I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. I'm so excited to welcome you back to my interview series, and today we're going to be speaking with Jennifer from English Outside the Box. Many of you know Jennifer and her enthusiasm, her passion for English teaching, and her motivation for helping you start to use everyday English, experience real life English, and really speak more naturally, just like I like talking about too. So I would love to give Jennifer a chance to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about what she means by English outside the box for those of you who may be new to Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's so nice to finally get to work with you in person, online in person.
In person. It's nice to meet you and see you face to face for sure. And thanks for the kind words. I mean, the enthusiasm, the passion, yes, that's all what I feel, what I experience, and what I hope translates in my videos and in my lessons. So if you got it, then I'm doing something right.
Definitely. And I think that people are going to leave this conversation feeling more energized. So I hope we have a lot of interesting tips to share that will get people feeling more passionate and inspired about their English learning journey.
Yes, perfect. So kicking it off, English Outside the Box was really created from my transition outside of the classroom, outside of the box that would be the classroom, and moving into online. And if I had to sum it up in like one sentence or a couple of sentences, I really felt limited in who I could help and what I could teach when I was teaching at a school in a classroom. You know, I had a curriculum I had to follow, resources I had to use, and I felt so many times that I had to say like, yes, well, I know the book says this, but actually you probably will hear this, or we actually use it like this. And I got really tired of, well, actually we use it like this, because textbooks don't always teach what's natural.
Exactly.
You know, and you focus a lot on like conversation skills and how we really do things. And, you know, I've heard so many times, even in my own learning with like Portuguese, is when we read a book, we kind of see it one way or like read it one way. And then when we get out and hear it, it's entirely different.
Absolutely. And you notice that people kind of get, speaking of the box analogy, I've noticed a lot of non-native speakers get kind of boxed in by what they learned in the classroom, and then they hear it used in a different way, and they're almost arguing with the native speaker, like, that's not how you use this phrasal verb, or like, that's not how you use this idiom. And there's so many different ways. So it's kind of like, if you free yourself from the box, then you're able to kind of open your mind to what else can come in.
Yes. And so, you know, outside the box is a play on words with like the box in the classroom. Of course, there's the expression think outside the box, which means like think differently, step outside of your comfort zone and do something different with your English. And it's interesting because I have some of my in-laws here, and my brother-in-law, who's from Brazil, had mentioned that so many people there still think, oh, I want to learn a language. I need to go to a school. I need to learn face-to-face. I need to be with a teacher. And that is just not how it is anymore. And obviously you're teaching online, I'm teaching online, so we both know that there's so much more powerful resources and materials online, not in your city, because so many students who live in a small city that don't have access to a native speaker or an English teacher may feel like they can't learn, and that's so not true, because you have to step outside of the box and learn differently.
Yeah. Okay. So I have to mention something about literally working inside of a box. When I was teaching at a language institute in Boston, the room was so small that, we would sometimes have up to 14 students in the classroom with me. And the room was perhaps not much wider than my desk. Obviously, you can't see it. And so, you're kind of like trapped in this box. And when you're kind of feeling this, like you're feeling like you're squished into this box, then it's really hard for you to open your mind and, open your mindset to really being able to embrace the language. And I've noticed, because I've worked with a lot of Brazilians, because Brazil has a lot of structures for how people get into university and how people get jobs and how people learn English even, it's hard sometimes for people to kind of shake off that, that kind of boxed in feeling and embrace the ability to learn. So I love what you're doing to kind of encourage people and demonstrate to people through really cool practical examples how it's possible to learn English anywhere. Like something you're doing that I think is so fascinating is you're doing this vocabulary challenge where people are showing pictures of things from their daily lives they can't name in English because they've never had to name it in English before. And you're kind of seeing like, hey, your real life has opportunities for you to learn. So I'd love for you to share how that works in your philosophy.
Everywhere, yeah. So this particular week, I am focusing on vocabulary. So I went over, 7 ways to learn, and one of them was using what's around you. Because I think, especially your audience, I know is a lot of advanced speakers. And so advanced learners, because we're all still learning a language even when we are advanced, right? Advanced learners kind of forget about those like daily things. They forget, this is in front of me, I'm obviously still moving like a tool. Like an advanced speaker might not know what this is in English because they've never had to use it. But you might be in a situation where you do need to use it. For example, like I'm pretty fluent in Portuguese and I can speak Portuguese really well. My father-in-law is here kind of restoring a bench, and we've been talking about all kinds of tools, and I don't know what this is in Portuguese. I didn't know. And so I was in the situation that I had to know. So going through your daily life, this vocabulary challenge was stop wherever you are, at work, at school, in your kitchen, in your bedroom, wherever you are, and look around and see what you already know. And then more importantly, identify what you don't know and then learn it, because it might help you in some way. It might connect you to another vocabulary word. It might connect you to more idioms related to that vocabulary word. And so, I've pushed it a lot on Instagram, where I've encouraged people to take a picture and tag me and then let me share it with my community, or let me just teach you like what it is, because it's important to learn kind of what's around you. And, you did mention I do focus on those everyday English skills because I don't use textbooks. I get out of the box, and I want people to use English that they're going to need in their real life. Conversation, work, travel, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I love that. And, you made me think of something I often encourage people to do, which is related, is that a lot of times talking about more advanced English speakers, they're missing the kind of language to discuss their daily routines, whether that's their daily routines at work, or one thing I often encourage my clients to do is talk through the process of making tea or making coffee or making a recipe.
I do this all the time. Yeah, I love that.
Exactly, because it really does encourage people to realize the vocabulary they're missing, that it's just because when we're more familiar with a process or an experience or a routine in our native language, it's harder to describe what we're doing. And I often tell the story about how I forgot the word for fork in Spanish, so I was like fluent in Spanish, participating in academic discussions in Spanish, and I couldn't talk about the fork that I would use to eat, because how often do I use that word? But it's important, because that's usually when you're missing that word, people are like, how do you not know the word for fork, and you think you're fluent, it can be one of those things that will reduce your confidence.
And depending on the situation that you were in where you needed to talk about this fork, if someone didn't know that you were participating in all of these academic discussions, the first impression is like, wow, her Spanish isn't very good if she doesn't even know fork. So first impressions, unfortunately, are there with English or any kind of language mistakes or whatever.
And I'm realizing as we're talking that you and I have very similar, learning and teaching philosophies, because something that I find that I'm often encouraging people to do is they have to prove that their English is as good as it is. If we think of speaking with native English speakers who don't speak another language, which is pretty common in the United States, they don't understand that your listening skills are often stronger than your speaking skills. So if you miss a word like fork, they immediately switch to thinking, oh, you don't really speak that much English. So you kind of are like, you have to prove you speak more than you really need to actually speak in the conversation, so that people will treat you with the level of respect and understanding that you have.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And then you talking kind of reminded me of something I do in my training programs as well, and with my students is, okay, so we learn a new vocabulary word, a new idiom, a new expression. Now, teach me that. Explain to me what that means, and then use it in a sentence. Because so many times, and I know we want to talk about that active and passive learning, active, passive listening. So many times students will have a goal of, I'm going to learn 5 new vocabulary words. And they sit down and they read the word, they read the definition, and they're like, all right, I got it, I learned it. And then they move on. And then they either never use it, or they don't truly understand it because they just think, oh yeah, I got it. But when it comes time to using it, it's like, and they're not sure. So I always try to have my students, okay, now tell me what that word means in your own words. And it's like, well, I know what it means in my own language. And it's like, yeah. And in English?
Okay, so I have a question for you because I have a feeling I know what the answer is. Something that I'm really, I guess against is not exactly the right word, but I really encourage people not to translate using a dictionary. When I used to teach in the classroom, I prohibited cell phones, translators, and the only thing I would let people use is the English to English dictionary. And they were so annoyed because they're like, you're not with the program. Like, you don't understand, the technology and it's just so quick, Google Translate. And I was like, no, this is forcing you to rely on your native language, which is forcing you to think in your native language. So I'd love to hear, either from your teaching experience or your learning experience, how, being able to just focus on your vocabulary in English helps you be able to achieve that level of fluency.
We are two peas in a pod because I feel the exact same way. I also prohibited those things when I taught in a classroom. And I really try to not use translators. And kind of a side note, maybe you get this question a lot. When I tell people what I do and I tell people that I teach English to non-native speakers, the first question is, how many languages do you speak? Because they think you need to know Russian to teach a Russian speaker, and you need to know Spanish to teach a Spanish speaker. But I focus on that immersion and not using a translator. And also because translators give zero context. Zero context. An example I often use with a lot of my Brazilian students is the word chato, for example. Like, if you translate that word, it means like boring and annoying. But in English, how different are those two words?
Yeah, totally different. Yeah.
And so when you translate that, you're going to be in a situation that you use boring instead of annoying, and then people are confused and maybe you offend someone. So translators just give no context. And with no context, you're never going to learn how to use it naturally in your own way, because you're always just going to have this incorrect, mysterious word that you have no idea how to use it.
Absolutely. And it's funny, I'm kind of laughing because I have my number one thing on the list I wanted to talk to you about: vocabulary in context, language in context, and it totally came up. And I think that that's something, one of the reasons I admire your style of teaching online and the way you do your live lessons. I mean, like you said, we're two peas in the pod, so I do similar things. What you do and what I do is we try to give people an example of a question that they may be asked or a word they may want to use, phrasal verbs. I know that because people are always so concerned about phrasal verbs, and it's really hard to teach them outside of context. So if you learn the actual way that people use them by discovering it yourself, which I talk about, I call it the discovery method. There might be a real term for it, but I call it the discovery method, where you are using like this type of conversation as a text to be able to understand how the word is used. For example, you use the word side note, and I have a video on the word side note, and it's like, oh, there's the word used in context. So I'm hoping that anyone who picks up on that will notice that, look, that's how somebody would actually use side note. Or if we're talking about conversation skills, you have to observe a conversation or participate in a conversation in order to learn those skills. So I'd love to hear, I saw you get excited, so I'd love to hear, some of your thoughts on vocabulary or language in context.
Yes. Gosh, it's funny that you said, like, oh, I got so excited when you use side note. So in my training program, one of the phrasal verbs I taught this month was swoop in. You call it the discovery method. I kind of focus, because I have a baby who's, a baby, and we're beginning to try to teach him language and stuff, I really started to try to think, like, how is he learning? What's he doing? How do native speakers learn? And so I really started to adopt the approach and try to explain that in my programs. And what I do, I try to teach English learners to learn like a native speaker so they can speak like a native speaker. So how do native speakers learn? Babies are just surrounded by English. They just hear it, and they do it passively. Babies aren't sitting there like, oh, what's my mom and dad saying? Like, they're not trying to listen. They just hear it. And then, parents, guardians, whoever, kind of start to introduce words and then teach words and then teach sentences. And then they try to teach it with more context. And then the students review, and then they shadow. So that's kind of like what I do. But I got really excited as well when I taught swoop in. And then I was at a birthday party this weekend, and I was having a conversation, and then somebody popped their head in the conversation and said something. And then another person in the conversation was like, oh, look at you swooping in the conversation. I was like, swoop in. And
let me record this.
I wrote a note on my phone, swoop in, Kayo, talking to Nana, gave the example so I could then go back and show my students, this really was used. used.
Yeah, I love that. So I love what you were mentioning, which was talking about creating, an immersion experience for your students. And this is something that I have so many things I want to ask you about.
How much time do we really have?
I know, right? This could go on for a while. No, but I think that go back to what you mentioned earlier about passive learning and active learning, because this is something that's important to me and one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you. And so something that happens for a lot of people is they're just passively absorbing lots of information. And sometimes people struggle to understand why. Well, first of all, they would struggle to understand why would someone like you or me start teaching online, and that we're trying to kind of be facilitators or guides, or, not just teachers, because teacher has that kind of structure of like being in the front of the classroom and like lecturing to the student. But we're trying to guide people to these type of immersion experiences or guide them to these real life uses of the language. So I'd love for you to kind of share your philosophy, because people who are watching this channel might be familiar with my philosophy from other videos on like the passive approach to learning and the active approach to learning, and how you kind of create these experiences for people, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Well, let's generalize it a little bit to like active and passive learning. So many students, I'm sure you've met a lot of people who are like, I can read, I can listen, my listening skills are, but I cannot speak. I need to speak. And so students think that the only way for them to improve speaking is to have a one-on-one class with a teacher, or to enroll in a school, or to do these things. But what I tell people is the reason you listen and read so well is because you are passively and actively doing these things all the time. But with speaking, you're thinking you only can do it actively to improve, and that's not true. You have to try to like include that passive speaking to where you're talking to yourself, you're reading things out loud, you're thinking in English and you're just vocalizing what you are thinking with words without focusing on getting corrected, someone correcting your vocabulary, your grammar. Like you have to just speak. You have to include that passive and active. So backing it up again, I think kind of describing what is passive and active learning. Passive learning is when you don't really have that intention of like sitting down with your goal and learning something. So it's when you're sitting in front of the TV because you want to relax and you're watching your favorite TV show with English subtitles, maybe with your own subtitles. But if it's an English TV show, you're passively hearing the language. It's reading street signs when you're traveling. It's scrolling through Instagram and finding your favorite teachers. It's watching this video lesson, all of the live lessons you do, that's all passive. And then you have to kind of switch to that active learning where you then get a goal, okay? You're watching this interview, great, but what are you going to do with it? What is going to be your walk away goal, your walk away, learning thing, if we want to just put it in a really simple term. So you have to then take something and actively learn for it. Maybe you're practicing listening skills with our real conversation. Maybe you're getting our tips.
I think it's just, it's just a good reminder for people to kind of question themselves and self-evaluate what's the style of learning I'm using. Because I think a lot of people think that the more exposure to the language, the better, by constantly watching every single potential YouTube video on English that exists out there and watching hours and hours of these videos. And they're frustrated because they're investing all this time, but they're not seeing results. And that's because it's just like you said, passive listening. You can watch Game of Thrones or Friends or whatever TV show that people like watching right now, because I don't watch a lot of TV, but people, obviously Friends is old, I know that, but like people think that I'm just listening to it all the time. And I think the thing I want to clarify that you did very well at clarifying is that passive listening is good, but you need to have an element of active listening. You need to have an element of actually like figuring out a way to apply or listen. Like, well, I guess what I would like to maybe talk a little more about is that passive listening, there's a time and a place for simply passive listening, or like you said, passive speaking, reading out loud passively, passive reading. And then there's a time where you want to take that same Game of Thrones episode and you want to listen to it actively, and you want to be able to do something specific or listen for something specific. And I know you have a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah. So the program that I created kind of does that, and how I create this situation for, my Conversation Club members is, week one, when we really sit down to learn and focus on our new language, we have 10 kind of main core vocabulary elements. We have phrasal verbs, we have idioms, and we have expressions. But the difference is I don't just say, Here's your list of 10. Here's the word. Here's a definition. Here's a sentence example. Good luck, because will that help them? Yeah. But I don't think that that's the best way. And so when we apply this discovery method or learn like a native, speak like a native, and incorporate this passive and active, what I do is I first provide an audio of me just speaking and using all of these words that we're going to focus on. So I read, a word, swoop in. She swooped in on the conversation. Swooped in, swoop in. So then they begin hearing what their target words are. And I say, do this passively. Put it on in the car. Put it on while you're doing dishes, while you're brushing your teeth. Just allow it to passively go in and just let your brain feel the English, hear the English, experience the English like a child would sitting in the middle of a room with an adult having a conversation. Once you allow that to kind of come in, switch to active. And now here's the audio of using all of these in context. So I've used like articles, videos, and I always use something that I don't personally create. It's been created and it's in the world already. So it's like I can create something and say this is natural, or I can say this was created by a native speaker and they weren't trying to teach English. They were really utilizing these expressions and stuff. And I think that's what's so important, is not that your students wouldn't trust us that this language is real, but it's like, look, it is real. It's there. I've used like TED Talks and magazine articles. And again, these aren't created for English learners. So like, how much more real can you get? And so then we really focus on hearing how it's used. And then once they hear how it's used, I say like, okay, what did you hear? What do you think it means? Try to identify the meaning. Try to define the meaning on your own. Then let's go to the next exercise, to the next resource. Then we'll review the definition. We'll review the context and we'll go over what it means and then start to develop the skill. Then they'll start using it, by reading out loud. They'll start using it with discussion questions. They'll start using it with ways to apply it to their own life. And as we move into like week 2 of the program, it really focuses on, okay, now you have this language, but what are you going to do with it? So this week we're focusing on applying it to your life and really connecting them with the language, because you speak a little bit of Spanish and Portuguese. Maybe your goal, your reason for that was different than why I do it. So you're going to need that language for something different. And so instead of teaching this blanket approach of like, here's how you can use it, I really try to connect the materials on a personal level to everyone to say, okay, how are you going to use it, And then we try to focus on that. And then as the conversation goes on, we focus on pronunciation, how it's used and everything. Well, just side note about the pronunciation thing, why I think kind of my last thing about why I think it's important to like actively and passively hear something is because, when you read, I've talked about swoop in. So let's use swoop in again. When you use swoop in, you read swoop in, swoop in. But then in a conversation, see, she swooped in, swooped in, swooped in. And you're like, swoop tin? Swoop tin? Like, what? It's not how you read it. How it sounds is not how it actually looks. So I think students run into that problem a lot where they read a swoop in phrasal verb and then it's used and they're like, oh, what? And so having all of those active passive components are so important because you can hear how it's used.
Okay, I have so many things to say. First, I'm going to start with the pronunciation point because otherwise I'm going to forget that. Like, I like that your approach also includes a focus on pronunciation and accent reduction, and not even necessarily them producing it the way we would, but your learners understanding it the way we would actually say it. Because I think that that's where a certain approaches to language learning, especially in a very traditional classroom or traditional teaching approach, it's that you're not hearing people actually pronounce the words like swooped in. We would always connect that, with connected speech. We'd always link those words together to focus with the stress on, the particle of the phrasal verb. But so many non-native speakers who study, by reading, buying an ebook with a list of phrasal verbs, or like, there's even some really great books that I recommend to people to learn phrasal verbs. You don't hear them said by a native speaker. You're not going to recognize it when you hear it. And then somebody will say, wait, what? What? And you'll ask the person to repeat themselves, and then they'll say it, and you'll be like, oh, I know that, swoop in, swoop in. But then that's when you create that choppiness. And I think that that's where some people who want to achieve greater degrees of fluency, they forget where the guidance of someone who is a trained teacher, who does think about what they're including in their programs, or even in their, their free resources, because I know you work just as hard as I do to create high quality free resources, is that we're actually considering what kind of information we're trying to draw your attention to. And that's where there's an advantage to learning natural English through real life text where people are drawing your attention to like the pronunciation or the way it's actually used, like you said in a TED Talk. Like you're seeking out these resources rather than the person just, oh, okay, I learned the word swoop in and then I never heard it again, because you're looking for it in your real life.
Yeah. And so I think that's, a little different than what we've talked about today, but I've said in past videos and past resources that students, English learners, should really focus as well on materials and resources created for an English-speaking audience, not an English learner. Because naturally, English teachers will maybe slow down their speech or will not connect speech as much because they're focusing or emphasizing something. So when you do listen to a TED Talk or a TV show or movie, that is really giving you that like focused practice on how it's really used. And I think, our connection and why I was really excited about this collaboration was because we really do focus on like conversational skills, being connected speech, real life, every day, and all of those things that are so important.
Yeah, and you just mentioned a really good point about that a lot of times, in an English teaching inside the box context, teachers they articulate every word individually. And there's even a lot of YouTube teachers who do the same thing for clarity because they want to help people at a lower level of English, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. There's some super talented teachers who articulate every word. But as you become more advanced, as you start to realize that that's not challenging you anymore, you realize that you have to listen to someone who is speaking naturally, whether that's, an English teacher like you or me who speaks the way we would normally speak, or by watching a native speaker give a TED Talk or one of those vlogs on YouTube where they're speaking a mile a minute, even faster than me, and that will help your ear adjust to that natural rhythm. So it's really important.
That is such a good point. Allowing your ear to adjust to the natural rhythm. I absolutely love that because, that is the difference of, I learned that word, and then when I heard it, I had no idea what it was. It was because you have to do more active learning and using it. I love that. Perfect.
And that brings up a good point I want to mention, because I know you have a course on, pronunciation for Portuguese speakers. Something that I think, and I know having worked with Portuguese speakers, that there's a lot of interference that we often get from our native language where we expect the sound to translate into English, for example, from Portuguese to English or from English into Spanish. That was a big problem I had, and I still have, is pronouncing the D sound in Spanish the way it's pronounced in various countries, because sometimes it's like a th sound and sometimes it's a hard D like in the United States. And so it's just a funny thing that, you have, like you said, like your ear has to adjust to that. If you're expecting English to be spoken the way that you would speak it with your native language, then it's like you're not going to understand a native speaker. A lot of accent reduction or improving your pronunciation isn't really about speaking perfectly like a native. It's about understanding the American accent, because we're both American, understanding the accent so you can actually decipher the conversation. That's what people forget, is that reducing your accent isn't necessarily about actually reducing your accent. It's about increasing your understanding of the native speaker accent.
Yes. And so this kind of touches back as well on our translation thing and not translating. And, you have to understand how the language sounds are. And you have to realize, the sounds are going to be different. And kind of because you speak a little Portuguese, right? Touching on that, reading thing, if you opened up a book in Portuguese and you read how to say, how are you? And you read TUDOBEM, and you had no idea what Portuguese sounded like, you would read that as...
I'm trying to think of how I would read it without Portuguese.
Yeah, you would say tudo bem.
Oh yeah, that's how I used to speak Spanish.
Oh yeah. So when I like tell my family, my American family, about Portuguese and I like write them stuff, or I said like bom dia is like, good morning. My mom writes to me like B-O-N, and I'm like, no, mom, it's B-O-M, because there is that confusion. The ending M and the ending N is so different in Portuguese, for example, in English. So part of learning and part of this like passive and active and learning is understanding the differences and what you need to know and like how things look, how things sound, how things are used. Like all of those are so important to think about, when you're learning.
Yeah, and I think you just sparked an idea for me, which is that I think that what you're identifying is kind of the bridge from kind of functional level of English to a more engaging, conversational, like you said, like we've been talking about fluency level of English. It's when you shift from English for a specific reason to achieve a certain goal to switching towards English as something I'm curious about, something that makes me question my own language, something that makes me question the way things are used and kind of absorb information from context, absorb information from real texts or real resources that real English, as you often talk about. And so it's kind of like, this is what we're talking about is moving the mindset from basically being I was talking on my live video today about an English learner who's learning English to someone who's an English speaker. It's kind of that switch where when you start embracing your ability to start actively using the language, this reminds me of something. I wanted to go back to what you said about connecting the language to your particular life, to your needs, to your desires, to your hopes, to your dreams, because that's how the language becomes part of you. And that's something I know you focus on a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Because we all need a different language for a different purpose. And so really connecting it is so, so important. Yeah. So that's why I try to use that kind of real material and really focus on that.
That's awesome. Something I would like to kind of wrap up by talking about is how, since we've been talking about our own experiences learning Spanish and Portuguese, because I think we both learn both and speak both at varying levels. I would like to talk about how, this kind of curiosity, this questioning of the language, this kind of enthusiasm for learning more about the language and culture, how you use that in your own learning experience and how that you bring that into your teaching experience.
Ooh, good question. Great question. We kind of talked about that idea of like fluency and like what is fluency. And, if you're watching this interview, Kim and I will both tell you, don't say, I want to be fluent in English, because it's not deep enough. You have to really explore and go deeper with why. What is fluency to you? What does it mean to be fluent? What will you be able to do when you feel, yes, I'm fluent in English, So, and then that's where you're like fine tuning that goal and, really being like curious and what can you do to reach that goal, and really understanding your need for it is going to help you identify the right teacher, the right course, the right program, the right materials, because not every resource out there is going to be good for what you need to do. And if you kind of waste time, I don't want to say it, if you just waste time, hours and hours and hours watching 1,000 YouTube videos a day, at the end of the day, can you sit down and say, today I learned, and that helped me achieve to my overall fluency goal of, and really kind of focusing in on that. And, so talking about that fluency, we talked before we hit record about we can not only lose fluency. So I, at one point, was able to write a 20-page paper in Spanish about a Spanish artist. I couldn't do that now. I completely lost that fluency. And then also, I would say I'm pretty fluent in Portuguese, but I'm never going to stop learning. And so I'm constantly having to reassess my goals, change what I'm doing, think about it in a different way. And so I encourage English learners to do the same thing. So don't lose your fluency that you already have. Maintain it by consistently doing something that's going to continue reaching, getting you to your goal, and then constantly be reevaluating your goal. Because when you say, I want to be fluent in English, there's no end game. There's nothing for you to measure, and there's nothing for you to feel at the end of a week, a day, a month, like, yes, I did something. And that is huge in terms of motivation, right?
Absolutely. I love that. And I'll include some links to some related videos on that topic because I think it's such an important point is that if you can't identify your goal of fluency, like what you actually mean by fluency, you're never going to know that you achieve it. And something that I've mentioned in other videos, but I'll share with you now is that I realized that I became fluent in conversational, like interactional with friends sort of Spanish when I lived in Argentina and I studied abroad there, and also in academic Spanish. But when I started working in Chile, especially, I realized that I didn't really have professional Spanish, so I had all kinds of embarrassing faux pas. I offended someone I worked with, just things that I didn't realize I was missing, that kind of more professional, especially because every culture has kind of a different approach to like what sounds professional. Like Americans tend to be more relaxed or more simple in our language, but that's a whole other conversation.
Other collaboration conversation.
Exactly. We'll save that for the next video. But like just that I think people need to understand that your fluency will change. And something that you mentioned that I want to reiterate, at times your fluency goal is just going to be to maintain your current level. And that's okay. I remember my Portuguese instructor in grad school told us at the end of our year, she said, do not lose your listening skills. Your speaking will disappear, but it will come back fastest. If your listening skills are gone, you're lost. Like you've lost your Portuguese. And I feel that way because I can totally still understand Portuguese. I listen to enough random Portuguese that I can understand it. I can't speak it, but I can understand it. And I trust when like life brings me to Brazil or I meet more Brazilians here in the US, like I'm going to have a chance to speak it more. And I think that that's just so important for people to understand. It's okay if your fluency goal is to maintain your current level. Like sometimes you'll need to push yourself to keep going, but sometimes you're just trying to maintain that active level of your language being there, and that's okay.
Yeah, but can you imagine if you had 5 to 10 minutes of Portuguese speaking practice every day, how much that would help you? And so that's like a huge part of what I do as well, is finding ways to connect for 5 minutes with self-speaking, group classes, conversation partners, like so many different ways to connect and use the language that is not always one-on-one with a teacher, So I think that's really important to, kind of at the end of all of this, to take away that we're learning outside the box here. We're learning in different ways, and be open to new ways of learning, and be open to, changing your goals and reassessing what you need to do, and include more active, include more passive, do more. Can we say the tagline of this video? Do more.
Yeah, it might actually be the title. Here's how to do more with your English in 5 to 10 minutes. So I have 2 final things I want to highlight that you mentioned. One, which is what you said, that sometimes it only takes 5 minutes, 10 minutes a day. If you, like I said, like there's like the kind of maintenance level or like slightly improving every day, which will mean big progress over the course of the year. And so many people tend to focus in these, like they'll spend 3 hours like once a month on their English, and they're expecting this massive results, but you'll actually potentially get faster results with a small amount on a regular basis. And that's why I know you have that monthly program.
And a smaller goal. So students who are like, should my goal be, should I learn 100 new words a month? It's like, no, right? I mean, why do you want to do that? What are you going to do with that? What's the reason for that? Like, what are you going to do with 100 new words? Are you going to use those 100 new words in a conversation this month? Doubtful. So having smaller, more realistic goals in everything you do is so important.
Yeah, even like 1 word a week that you've totally embraced can really, if it's a word that's useful in everyday life, it can really actually make you sound more natural, which I know we talk about. The last thing I want to mention that you also mentioned, that I was like, oh, that's exactly what I'm gonna talk about this in another video, that I think it's so important for non-native speakers, especially who are using resources like, free resources like you and I have, and also our programs and courses, is to just understand that you have to be kind of self-reflective and understand that not everything's going to be for you. I mean, English has so many levels. Learning a language has so many levels that what's right for you at one point may not be right for you in the future, or you may advance past something that you once loved, or you may be able to use resources that are a little easier to review, and then resources that are more challenging, like watching, a TV show, or watching, a vlog from one of the famous YouTube vloggers or something. I just want to underscore that because I will be recording a video on that, but it requires this kind of self-reflection. Is this resource right for you? Is it a comfortable challenge? Is it helping you achieve your goals? I often say to people, hey, maybe my channel's not right for you, and that's okay, but you need to decide, what does this fit in your fluency journey? And I want to hear if you have any final thoughts on that.
Yes, on everything you said. And something else that's really important for English learners to know that, you mentioned that we both work really hard to provide, a lot of free English resources to people. And so many of our fellow online English teachers work so hard to create free materials online. But what learners need to understand is the material that we create has to be kind of generalized for this large audience. So there's no way that one human being can make one super high quality, effective professional resource that's going to help someone with zero level of English and someone with proficient English, someone who needs grammar but also needs vocabulary, who also needs pronunciation, and then phrasal verbs. Like, that just doesn't exist. And so that's where learners need to understand, like, identifying your goal and then saying, okay, then I need to find maybe the program, the course, the ebook, the resources that are made for my goal. And that's where programs and courses and investment come in, because sometimes the free resources, although they're fabulous and high quality, it is kind of this like generalized idea. So you need to focus in on what you want. It's just like any college degree. You're never going to get your college degree like studying everything, I guess. You have to go focused. You have to like go into what you need.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, because that's a conversation that sometimes it's kind of like what you're saying about being outside the box. We have an expression, square peg, round hole. You're trying to fit something that doesn't fit, the square peg into the round hole. It's not made to go together. So, you really want to make sure that you try to figure out how things fit in your journey, and that a lot of times with teaching resources, there's a lot of good quality stuff, like you said, like we and our colleagues offer for free. But the reason you would offer programs is to enable you to go deeper with people who are motivated to take that next step with you. And that's just something I just want to underscore, because sometimes people say, I've seen this, like, why do you offer this paid program? Why can't you just offer it for free? And it's because, it's distilling all of the years of our experience and all of our knowledge and all of our background into a program that will get you results. And it's something that you want to see people taking action on. And so actually, I would love for you to share some of the programs that you have that you might want to invite people to just take a look at to see if it's right for them.
Yes. And that's huge if it's right for them. So, identifying what is right for you. I said it, you said it, I'll say it again, like we can keep saying it. That's what's so important. So, I've talked a little bit about like the Conversation Club, that monthly training program. That's where I talked about, week 1, we introduced passive material, active material, definitions, resources. Week 2, we connect it to, how you can use it, every learner, every member in their own life. We focus on pronunciation and use. This Conversation Club has group conversation calls where students do get to meet with me and ask me questions and practice with the language and speak. I personally connect all of the members with another member who speaks a different language so they can get together and they can talk and they can use the language. I've started doing a new thing where I do like conversation meetups where other members can come together. I have speaking self activities, group speaking activities, So this, and I create it, and I'm getting new material in the club every single week. There's something new to learn. And so that idea is learn like a native speaker to speak like a native speaker. And it focuses on phrasal verbs, idioms, and expressions that are used naturally, so you know how to use them naturally and say them in your own conversations.
Can I join?
Come on in. I'll connect you with, I think you would probably be everyone's favorite partner to have.
I know, I might be a little too advanced for that.
But that's also a really, really good point of who is it for. So I have students who are like intermediate to advanced. And because I connect people with conversation partners, I put the advanced speakers with the advanced speakers and I put the intermediate with the intermediate, So it does kind of help a wide range of people. And so that course is really to improve your speaking and to get the materials, the resources, and the opportunities to speak English every single day, because you don't want to lose that fluency you have.
I love it. That sounds like an amazing program. I really do want to join.
Well, you'll have a link, somewhere to check it out.
Yeah, there'll be a link below the video and, probably in the card somewhere in the video.
Here and there and everywhere we are. My website is EnglishOutsideTheBox.com, and people can learn, more about me and kind of see what I do there as well. And then you mentioned, I believe you have a pretty large Portuguese-speaking audience, oi?
Yeah, there's a lot of Brazilians here.
Hey, Brazilians. So I have a pronunciation course that is, English Pronuncia para Pessoas que Falam Português, right? So like for Portuguese-speaking students, a Portuguese course focusing on the 6 most common mistakes that they make when speaking English, why they're mistakes, and how to reverse them. So yeah, so that's a little bit about what I do online.
Yeah, definitely check out Jennifer's resources and be sure to join her community on YouTube too, because she's got live lessons, I think on Tuesdays, right?
Yeah, every Tuesday, 8:30 a.m.
Perfect. So it won't interfere with joining my live lessons as well. Yeah, so you can double, get 2 per week, keep your fluency going.
Connecting to it every day. That's what we're doing here.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jennifer. It was so fun to talk to you. I hope those of you watching have gotten a lot of insights. And like we discussed in the video, be sure to have some takeaways. What are you going to focus on next? I'm going to re-listen to this recording and really pay attention to what she said about, I'm getting my fluency for this. And she had a really good phrase. But be sure to write that down, because I think it's really important for you to identify your goals and to really start putting something into practice that's related to your goals, your needs, your desires to keep improving your English.
Thank you so much for having me and inviting me for this collaboration. We've been talking for a while. I feel like we could continue talking. We have so much of the same philosophies, and I think, our audiences, like the people that we teach, really are kind of the same type of learner. So, thanks for having me, and hi, audience and community. It's so nice to connect with you.
Yeah, I think we have to do a collaboration soon just to keep getting these ideas flowing and keep inspiring you guys to learn.
I think we will.
Thank you all so much for joining us. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to share it with a friend. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and also subscribe to Jennifer's YouTube channel. I'll include the link in the end screen at the end here, so you'll be able to join her there. Once again, I'm Kim from EnglishWithKim.com. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. Have a good one. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.